There's one sign, more reliable than any other single indicator, that tells you clearly whether you're dealing with a narcissist. And once you know exactly what to look for, you'll be able to spot it faster than any personality trait, any pattern of behavior, any accumulation of red flags that usually takes months or years to fully piece together. Here it is. Watch what happens when you tell them no. Not a dramatic no, not a confrontation, just an ordinary, reasonable no, declining a request, disagreeing with an opinion, setting a small boundary about something that genuinely doesn't require justification. This single moment, more than anything else, reveals almost everything you need to know, and it's worth understanding exactly why this specific test is so much more reliable than the more commonly discussed warning signs most people look for instead. Let's start with why this particular moment is so revealing, because understanding the mechanism explains why it works so consistently across such wildly different personalities, backgrounds, and presentations. Most warning signs people are taught to watch for excessive charm, obvious arrogance, a need to dominate conversations are actually unreliable indicators on their own, because plenty of genuinely kind, healthy people display some of these traits too. And plenty of narcissists, particularly covert ones, display none of them at all. What separates a narcissist from a healthy person isn't found in how they behave when things are going their way. It's found specifically in how they respond the instant something doesn't. Here's what a healthy response to being told no actually looks like, because it's worth establishing this baseline clearly before contrasting it with what you're actually watching for. A reasonably secure person, told no about something they wanted, might feel genuine disappointment. This is normal, human, and not itself concerning. But that disappointment typically stays proportionate to the actual situation, gets processed relatively quickly, and doesn't require the other person to manage or fix it. There might be a moment of, "Oh, that's too bad," or a brief attempt to understand the reasoning, followed by acceptance, even if the acceptance isn't entirely enthusiastic. The disappointment belongs to them, and they carry it themselves, without converting it into your problem to solve. Here's what a narcissist's response looks like instead, and it's worth understanding the specific pattern because it tends to follow a remarkably consistent sequence regardless of the individual person's particular style or personality. The first thing you'll typically notice is a disproportion between the size of the no and the size of the reaction. A simple, reasonable boundary met with a response that feels wildly out of scale with what actually happened. This disproportion is the first, most immediate signal worth paying attention to, because healthy disappointment rarely produces intensity this far removed from the actual stakes of the situation. The second thing worth watching for is where the reaction gets directed. A healthy response to disappointment stays focused on the disappointment itself. Sadness about not getting what was wanted, maybe some genuine curiosity about the reasoning behind the no. A narcissist's response typically redirects almost immediately toward you, your character, your motives, your supposed selfishness or coldness for having said no in the first place. This redirection is worth understanding as genuinely significant because it reveals something important. The no isn't actually being processed as information about a boundary. It's being processed as an attack requiring retaliation, which tells you everything about how this person actually understands the relationship's underlying structure. Here's the third thing worth watching for, and it's perhaps the most reliable indicator of all: whether the reaction includes some version of making you responsible for managing their resulting emotional state. This might sound like sudden pointed silence clearly designed to be noticed and addressed. It might sound like an explicit statement that you've hurt them, delivered with an expectation that you'll now need to comfort or reassure them. It might sound like a subtle shift in warmth throughout the rest of the day or week, punishing the no indirectly rather than addressing it directly. Whatever form it takes, the underlying function is the same: converting your reasonable boundary into a problem you now need to solve, effectively teaching you, through repeated exposure to this exact pattern, that saying no costs more than it's worth. Let's talk about why this specific test, watching what happens after a no works so much more reliably than the more commonly discussed warning signs people are usually taught to look for, because understanding the reasoning behind this makes the test genuinely useful rather than just another item on a checklist. Here's the core insight worth understanding. Almost anyone, including a genuine narcissist, can perform warmth, generosity, and charm convincingly when things are going their way, and nothing is actually being asked of them that they don't want to give. This is precisely why early-stage relationships with narcissists so often feel wonderful, sometimes even exceptional. There's usually very little friction yet, very little reason for the underlying pattern to surface, because nothing has actually required them to accept disappointment or accommodate someone else's genuine limits. The performance of a good partner is remarkably easy to maintain when you're never actually being told no. This is exactly why waiting for obvious red flags, bragging, arrogance, visible cruelty, often takes so much longer to reveal a narcissist than simply watching this one specific moment. Those more obvious signs typically only emerge once enough time has passed for the relationship to have accumulated enough history, enough investment, enough genuine stakes for the mask to occasionally slip under pressure. The no response test doesn't require any of that accumulated history. It can be observed remarkably early, sometimes within the first few weeks of knowing someone, because it doesn't depend on major relationship stress to surface. It only requires one ordinary, low-stakes moment where you decline something small and watch carefully what actually happens next. Here's something worth understanding specifically about why this test works even against skilled, covert narcissists who might successfully disguise every other warning sign for months or years. Even the most practiced, most convincingly humble covert narcissist still depends, at some fundamental level, on the people around him remaining reliably compliant with his actual needs and preferences, because his entire fragile sense of self requires that predictability to feel stable. This dependency doesn't disappear simply because someone has gotten skilled at hiding the more obvious signs of grandiosity or arrogance. It simply gets expressed more subtly when a genuine no arrives, not through obvious anger, but through the quieter, more disguised patterns we discussed in earlier videos throughout this series. Hurt feelings requiring your management, guilt-inducing silence, a subtle but unmistakable shift in warmth that punishes the boundary without ever announcing itself as punishment. This is worth understanding as the reason this test remains reliable even against the more sophisticated presentations, the ones that successfully evade almost every other commonly discussed warning sign. The specific dependency on predictable compliance runs underneath both grandiose and covert presentations equally, which means the reaction to genuine, unexpected disappointment reveals it in both cases, even when everything else about the two presentations looks completely different on the surface. Here's a specific practical way to actually apply this test in your own life, because understanding the theory only matters if you know how to use it deliberately. Early in any new relationship, romantic, friendship, even professional, look for a genuine, low-stakes opportunity to say no to something. This doesn't need to be manufactured artificially or turned into some kind of deliberate trap. Genuine opportunities arise naturally in almost any developing relationship. Decline an invitation you're not actually interested in. Disagree calmly and without excessive hedging with an opinion you don't share. State a small preference that goes against what they wanted. Then simply watch what happens next, paying specific attention to the three signals we discussed, whether the reaction is disproportionate to the actual stakes, whether it redirects toward your character rather than staying focused on their own disappointment, and whether it includes any expectation that you'll now need to manage or repair their resulting emotional state. If the response is disappointment that stays proportionate, stays focused on itself rather than redirecting toward you, and resolves without requiring anything further from you, that's a genuinely good, meaningful sign, worth taking seriously as real evidence of emotional health and security. If the response includes any combination of the three signals we've described, that's worth taking equally seriously, not as a reason for immediate dramatic conclusions after a single instance, but as information worth watching for confirmation across subsequent similar moments. Let's bring this together into what actually matters most as we close out this discussion, because understanding this single test is only useful if you actually trust yourself to apply it consistently, rather than talking yourself out of what you've already clearly observed. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. One instance of this reaction, while genuinely worth noting, isn't necessarily conclusive evidence on its own. Everyone has occasional bad days, occasional moments of disproportionate reaction that don't reflect a genuine underlying pattern. This is simply part of being human, and holding a single instance against someone as definitive proof would be both unfair and inaccurate. What actually matters is consistency across multiple instances, ideally spread across enough time and enough different unrelated situations that coincidence becomes an increasingly unlikely explanation. This is worth understanding as the same principle we've discussed throughout this entire series regarding pattern recognition more broadly. A single data point is simply information, but a consistent pattern repeated reliably across different contexts is genuinely meaningful evidence worth taking seriously. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it's genuinely important for how you actually use this test going forward. The value of this specific sign isn't just in identifying narcissists you haven't yet gotten deeply involved with. It's equally valuable, perhaps even more valuable, for evaluating relationships you're already deeply invested in, where the accumulated history and emotional investment might otherwise make it harder to see this pattern clearly. If you find yourself in an existing relationship consistently avoiding saying no because you already, on some level, know exactly how it will be received, the disproportionate reaction, the redirection toward your character, the expectation that you'll manage the resulting fallout, that avoidance itself is worth recognizing as significant information, even if you've never consciously named the underlying pattern driving it until this exact moment. Here's the third thing worth understanding as we close this discussion, and it connects directly to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series. Recognizing this pattern clearly doesn't obligate you to any specific action beyond the recognition itself. You don't need to immediately end a relationship the first time you notice this reaction. You don't need to confront the person directly about what you've observed, especially not before you've gathered enough consistent evidence to trust your own conclusion fully. What this recognition actually offers you is something quieter and, in its own way, more valuable. Accurate information, trusted on your own terms, that you can use to inform your own decisions at whatever pace actually feels right for your specific situation. This is worth understanding as the genuine power of this single test, more significant than any elaborate checklist of warning signs you might otherwise try to memorize and apply. It doesn't require you to become an expert in narcissistic personality patterns, doesn't require months of careful, exhausting analysis, doesn't require you to catch every subtle manipulation tactic in real time as it's happening. It simply requires you to notice one specific thing consistently across enough moments to trust the pattern. What actually happens every time when this person doesn't get what they want from you? If you're currently in a relationship where you're recognizing this exact pattern clearly, perhaps for the first time, having never quite had language for what you were noticing until this discussion, I want you to trust what you're seeing. You don't need to doubt yourself simply because the reaction is often subtle, often disguised as hurt feelings or reasonable-sounding complaint rather than obvious anger. The disproportion, the redirection, the expectation of your management, These three signals, observed consistently, tell you something genuinely reliable about the actual structure underneath the relationship, regardless of how convincing or charming everything else about the person might otherwise be. And if you're currently evaluating someone new, still early enough in the relationship that this pattern hasn't yet had many opportunities to reveal itself, understand that you don't need to wait months or years, accumulating painful evidence the hard way before you have access to genuinely useful information. The next ordinary, low-stakes no you offer will tell you something real, something worth paying close, careful attention to, regardless of how wonderful everything else about this person currently seems. Watch what happens when you say no. It remains consistently one of the most reliable, most immediately accessible pieces of information available to you in any relationship, and trusting what it reveals rather than talking yourself out of it because everything else feels so promising is one of the most protective things you'll ever learn to do. There's something worth naming honestly here because it addresses a specific kind of self-doubt that often accompanies this recognition. The worry that noticing this pattern makes you the unreasonable one, someone hunting for problems in an otherwise good relationship, someone who's become suspicious or difficult simply for paying this close attention to how disagreement gets handled. I want to address this worry directly because it's genuinely common and it often gets reinforced, ironically, by the exact pattern you're trying to recognize. A narcissist's disproportionate reaction to your no frequently includes some version of framing your boundary setting itself as evidence that you're the problem, which can make you doubt whether noticing the pattern at all reflects your own oversensitivity rather than his actual behavior. Here's the honest distinction worth holding on to. Noticing how someone responds to disappointment isn't hunting for problems. It's simply paying attention to information that's freely, openly available in any relationship, healthy or otherwise. A genuinely secure, healthy person has nothing to fear from you noticing this pattern because there's nothing concerning there to find. Their response to your no will simply be proportionate, self-contained, and resolved without requiring anything further from you, which means this kind of attention applied to a healthy relationship produces nothing but reassurance rather than concern. The discomfort of applying this test only arises when there's actually something worth being uncomfortable about, which is precisely why it's such a useful, clarifying tool rather than something to feel guilty about using. It's also worth understanding that this test isn't about becoming someone who says no, constantly, deliberately manufacturing conflict in order to test people repeatedly. That would be its own kind of unhealthy pattern, treating every relationship as a suspicious hypothesis requiring ongoing interrogation rather than allowing genuine trust to develop naturally over time. The test works precisely because it doesn't require constant, deliberate testing. Ordinary life provides plenty of genuine, low-stakes opportunities for disagreement and boundary setting without you needing to manufacture them artificially. Simply paying honest attention to how these naturally occurring moments get received is sufficient. You don't need to go looking for conflict in order to gather this information. You simply need to notice, honestly, what already happens during the disagreements and boundaries that arise naturally in the ordinary course of getting to know someone. If you find yourself second-guessing whether you're allowed to trust this pattern once you've noticed it, I want you to return to a simple, grounding question. Would a reasonable, emotionally healthy person consider what I witnessed to be a normal, proportionate reaction to a small, ordinary no? If the honest answer is no, if the reaction genuinely was disproportionate, genuinely did redirect toward your character, genuinely did require you to manage the resulting fallout, then trusting that observation isn't oversensitivity, it's simply accurate perception. Exactly the kind of accurate perception this entire series has spent so much time encouraging you to reclaim and trust, especially after experiences that may have specifically taught you to doubt it. You're allowed to notice. You're allowed to trust what you notice. And you're allowed to let that trusted observation genuinely inform how much of yourself you continue offering to someone who's already shown you clearly exactly what your reasonable boundaries cost them to receive.